Under cover of absolute darkness, the mine-layer Nusret crept through the Dardanelles on March 8, 1915, her crew dropping 26 deadly flowers into the black water along the Erinköy line mines that would soon feast on British steel. The fate of 3 empires hung on these narrow straits. If the Allied fleet broke through to Constantinople, the Ottoman Empire would collapse, Russia would receive desperately needed supplies, and the Central Powers would face a war on yet another front. For the defenders, failure meant not just military defeat, but the end of 6 centuries of Ottoman rule. The sound of grinding metal echoed across the Gallipoli Peninsula as German engineers positioned massive Krupp guns in concrete emplacements. At Rumeli Masidiye and Namazgah, trained Ottoman crews practiced loading the behemoth's 240 to 355mm cannons, capable of punching through the thickest naval armor. The salt air carried the acrid smell of gun oil and fresh concrete as fortifications rose along both sides of the straits. Otto Lehmann von Sanders, the German general commanding the Ottoman Fifth Army, knew the Allies were coming. Intelligence reports spoke of a massive fleet assembling in the eastern Mediterranean. British and French battleships, the pride of their navies, steaming toward what their admirals believed would be a swift passage to the Ottoman capital. Sanders paced the ramparts above the straits, his weathered face grim as he surveyed the defensive positions stretching from Asia to Europe. The Ottoman forces under his command were a mixture of seasoned veterans and green conscripts from the Anatolian heartland. Savat Pasha had spent months preparing the fixed defences, positioning artillery batteries at calculated intervals along the coastline. The mobile field forces fell under Esat Pasha's Third Corps, men who would soon prove their mettle against the coming storm. In the trenches and gun emplacements, Ottoman soldiers could taste the metallic tang of anticipation. Many had never seen the sea before their deployment to these barren hills. They cleaned their Mauser rifles with meticulous care, each man knowing his life might depend on the weapon's reliability. The younger soldiers wrote letters home to villages scattered across Anatolia, their hands shaking slightly as they formed the Arabic script by flickering candlelight. Among the artillery crews, one name would soon echo through history: Corporal Sayit, a giant of a man stationed with the heavy guns overlooking the straits. His massive hands could lift shells that required mechanical hoists, though historians would later debate whether his legendary feat actually occurred. What remained undisputed was his courage and the deadly accuracy of the Ottoman gunners who served the coastal batteries. The morning of March 18th arrived crisp and clear, the kind of day that promised perfect visibility for naval gunnery. Vice Admiral John de Robeck's Allied fleet approached in battle formation British and French dreadnoughts, leading a flotilla of cruisers and destroyers. Their combined firepower dwarfed anything the Ottomans could muster, or so the Allied commanders believed. The first shells began falling at long range, massive projectiles screaming overhead to explode among the coastal fortifications. Ottoman gun crews crouched in their reinforced positions, feeling the earth shake with each impact. Dust and debris rained down as the naval bombardment intensified, the very air seeming to vibrate with the thunder of heavy artillery. But Tofaneli Ismail Hakka's secret work on the Nusret was about to prove decisive. As Allied minesweepers cleared the obvious defensive lines, the battleships moved confidently into the straits, unaware they were entering a carefully prepared killing ground. The mines laid along the Erinköy line waited in the dark water like patient predators. At 2:06 in the afternoon, the French battleship Bouvet struck one of those hidden mines. The explosion tore through her hull with tremendous force, and within minutes the pride of the French Navy rolled over and sank, taking most of her crew with her. The Ottoman gunners cheered as they saw the enemy flagship disappear beneath the churning waters. The carnage was far from over. HMS Irresistible and HMS Ocean followed Bouvet to the bottom within hours, victims of the same methodical preparation that had transformed the Dardanelles into a ship's graveyard. The Ottoman batteries, firing armor-piercing shells at 8 to 12 rounds per minute, added their own deadly contribution to the slaughter. Picture yourself standing on those limestone cliffs, watching the most powerful fleet in the world turn and flee, leaving behind the burning wrecks of their finest warships. The naval attack had failed catastrophically, but both sides knew this was only the beginning. Allied landing forces were already assembling in Egypt and on Greek islands, preparing for an assault that would determine whether the Ottoman Empire lived or died. The question now was not whether the enemy would come ashore, but where and whether the defenders could hold the beaches when they did. At dawn on April 25th, 1915, the first Allied landing boats ground against the pebbled shores of Gallipoli as Ottoman machine guns opened fire from cliffs rising 300 meters above the waterline, turning the morning sea crimson. This was the moment that would determine whether the British Empire could salvage its grand strategy or watch it die in the surf. Success here meant a direct route to Constantinople and victory over Germany's most important ally. Failure would trap hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers on a hostile peninsula, bleeding them white under the Ottoman Sunday. The sound of grinding metal echoed across the waters as landing ramps dropped and men poured onto the beaches under withering fire. At Cape Helles, near the ancient fortress of Suvla Bay, British soldiers stumbled forward through knee-deep water that quickly turned red with blood. The smell of cordite mixed with salt spray as Ottoman defenders poured rifle and machine gun fire down from commanding positions carved into the limestone cliffs. Halil Sami Bey's 9th Division had prepared these killing grounds with methodical precision. Machine gun nests positioned at 200 to 400 meters raked the boats before they could reach shore. The gunners had pre-sighted their weapons, marking range cards for every possible landing point. When the first wave of British troops approached V Beach and W Beach, they walked into a carefully orchestrated slaughter. The boats themselves became death traps. Men packed shoulder to shoulder had nowhere to hide as bullets punched through thin steel hulls. Some craft, holed below the waterline, began sinking before reaching shore. Soldiers weighed down with equipment and ammunition disappeared beneath the surface, their hands clawing desperately at the water before vanishing forever. Others, wounded in the boats, bled out on wooden benches as their comrades stepped over them to reach the ramps. Those who made it to the beaches found no sanctuary. The Ottomans had spent months preparing interlocking fields of fire, positioning riflemen in concealed positions among the rocks and scrub vegetation. Every gully and depression had been mapped, every piece of cover targeted. British soldiers crawling forward on their bellies could taste the grit and salt as they pressed their faces into the sand, trying to become invisible to the marksmen above. Meanwhile, 12 kilometers north at Aribernu, what would become known as ANZAC Cove, Australian and New Zealand forces faced an equally desperate situation. The cove was smaller than planned, hemmed in by steep ridges that provided perfect sniper positions for Ottoman defenders. The ANZACs had landed in the wrong place, but retreat was impossible with more boats arriving every minute behind them. From his position near Bigala, Lieutenant Colonel Mustafa Kemal felt the earth tremble with naval gunfire and knew this was no feint. The 34-year-old commander of the 19th Division had been waiting for this moment. His 57th, 72nd, and 77th regiments positioned to respond to any landing along the peninsula's western coast. As reports reached him of enemy forces climbing the ridges near Aribernu, Kemal made the decision that would define his legacy. The forced march to contact began immediately. Ottoman soldiers, many carrying 60-round ammunition loads, moved at double pace through the scrubland toward the sound of gunfire. They could smell the smoke from naval shells exploding among the pine trees and taste the dust kicked up by hundreds of marching feet. The metallic tang of fear filled their mouths as they approached their first major battle. By late morning, Kemal's men reached the ridgelines overlooking the ANZAC positions. What they saw below them was organized chaos. Allied soldiers streaming up the steep slopes, some already establishing defensive positions on the crests, others still struggling to reach the top under heavy fire. The sound of rifle shots echoed off the hills, like the cracking of whips. At Conkbayırı, the highest point overlooking the landing beaches, Kemal surveyed the tactical situation with cold calculation. If the ANZAC secured these heights, they could dominate the entire peninsula. There would be no second chance, no opportunity to withdraw and regroup. This ridge had to be held at any cost. His order to the 57th Regiment became legendary. "I do not order you to attack. I order you to die. In the time it takes us to die, other forces and commanders can come and take our place." The men who heard those words knew they were being asked to sacrifice their lives for their homeland. Many would never see another sunset. Ottoman stretcher bearers, working the forward positions, later reported a detail that would haunt survivors, their boots slipping on blood-wet shale at the second ridge by noon. The limestone rocks, normally providing sure footing, became treacherous as wounded and dying men from both sides bled out among the thorn bushes and scattered boulders. The battle was far from decided, but the pattern was already clear. Unlike the failed naval assault, this would be a fight measured in yards gained and lost, in individual acts of courage and desperation. The Ottomans had the advantage of position and preparation, but the Allies had numbers and the determination of men who knew retreat meant death in the surf behind them. Can you imagine standing on those cliffs, watching thousands of enemy soldiers climbing toward your position while knowing that retreat would mean the end of everything you'd sworn to defend? As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the peninsula, both sides settled into positions that would define months of brutal trench warfare. But first, the immediate question of survival had to be answered in the gathering dusk. A Turkish private stuffed tobacco up his nose and crawled through the May 24th truce to trade a cigarette for an ANZAC tunic button, while around him over 3,000 corpses baked in the Mediterranean sun after 5 weeks of continuous slaughter. This 8-hour armistice to bury the dead would prove that even in the depths of mechanized warfare, the human decency could still surface, but it also revealed the horrific reality that Gallipoli had become a charnel house where men lived like rats in holes, separated by mere yards from enemies they could hear breathing at night. The smell hit you first when approaching the forward trenches, a nauseating cocktail of rotting flesh, human waste, and the sickly sweet stench of gangrene that no amount of lime could mask. Ottoman soldiers wrapped cloth around their faces, but the odor penetrated everything, clinging to uniforms and equipment until men lost their appetite for days at a time. In the worst sections, burial details worked in shifts, vomiting between loads as they carried decomposing bodies to shallow graves behind the lines. The opposing trenches had evolved into an intricate maze, separated by distances that could be measured in footsteps, 20 to 40 meters of no man's land, strewn with barbed wire, unexploded shells, and the corpses of men who had tried to cross that deadly space. Ottoman soldiers could hear Allied conversations drifting across the gap on still nights, English, French, and that peculiar accent from the far side of the world that marked the Australians and New Zealanders. Daily survival became an exercise in endurance that would have broken men in peacetime. The standard ration for many Ottoman soldiers consisted of 600 to 800 grams of bread or hardtack, bulgur wheat, olives, and if they were fortunate, 100 grams of salted meat. Tea remained scarce, a luxury that officers sometimes shared among entire companies. Water arrived by mule and barrel from wells near Maidos and Conkbayırı, but summer consumption exceeded 4 litres per man per day, leaving most soldiers chronically dehydrated. The heat of July and August brought new torments. Dysentery struck down entire sections, reducing unit strength by 20 to 40% as men collapsed from dehydration and blood loss. Malaria followed, carried by mosquitoes that bred in stagnant pools of water mixed with blood and filth. Lice infested every uniform, multiplying so rapidly that sanitary squads boiled clothing in cauldrons near streams, only to watch the parasites return within days. Fly swarms blackened latrine pits by midday, covering everything with a writhing carpet of insects that made eating a constant battle. Men learned to wolf down their meager rations quickly, covering their food with one hand while spooning with the other. The sound became part of the daily routine, the angry buzzing that never ceased, punctuated by the slap of hands against necks and faces as soldiers fought their microscopic tormentors. Ottoman uniforms had evolved from the traditional wool to khaki drill cotton, better suited to the Mediterranean climate. The old rigid fez gave way to the kabalak, a wrapped cap that provided protection from both sun and shrapnel fragments. Many soldiers wrapped additional cloth around their heads, creating makeshift turbans that helped reduce heat stroke during the scorching afternoon hours. Communication between units relied on field telephones when the lines remained intact, but cut cables forced constant reliance on runners. These messengers faced casualty rates that appalled even seasoned commanders. Young soldiers sprinted between trenches carrying vital orders, many cut down by sniper fire before reaching their destinations. The crack thud of Mauser rounds hitting sandbag faces became the soundtrack of daily life, punctuated by the distinctive whistle of incoming artillery. A single mislaid donkey pannier of quinine reportedly left an entire battalion feverish during the August heatwave at Suvla, illustrating how precarious the medical supply situation had become. Every pill, every bandage, every dose of morphine had to be carried up impossible terrain under constant enemy observation. Medical stations at Conkbayırı and Akbaş treated abdominal wounds with limited chloroform, while evacuation to hospitals in Çanakkale took hours over rough tracks that jarred wounded men into unconsciousness. The night brought its own terrors and opportunities. Darkness meant sapping operations, methodical digging that brought listening posts 5 to 10 meters closer to enemy lines each week. Ottoman engineers worked with muffled tools, stopping frequently to listen for sounds of countermining activities. The slightest noise could trigger a deadly race to complete underground charges, before the enemy detected the tunneling operations. Periscope rifles allowed snipers to engage targets while remaining concealed, but the psychological strain of constant observation wore down even veteran soldiers. Men learned to move in brief rushes, timing their movements to artillery barrages that might mask the sound of their passage. The tension never ended. Sleep came in fragments between artillery bombardments and sniper exchanges. The 24th of May armistice revealed the true cost of this warfare. British and Ottoman burial parties worked side by side, their white armbands providing temporary immunity from the killing that had consumed both armies. Soldiers traded small items, buttons, cigarettes, photographs, while around them the evidence of modern warfare's efficiency lay scattered across the hillsides. Within 8 hours, over 3,000 bodies found their way to hastily dug graves, but everyone knew this was merely a pause in the slaughter. Can you imagine the surreal experience of sharing cigarettes with men you'd been trying to kill just hours before, knowing that tomorrow you'd return to the methodical business of mutual destruction? As the armistice ended and soldiers returned to their trenches, both sides understood that the real battle for Gallipoli was just beginning, and it would be won not by grand gestures, but by the daily accumulation of small advantages measured in blood and endurance. In the roof trenches of Lone Pine, an Australian bayonet punched through a wooden beam and into an Ottoman soldier's chest, while above them, splintered logs collapsed under the weight of men trying to kill each other in underground darkness that stank of blood and cordite. August 1915 would prove that modern warfare could still descend into medieval savagery when desperate commanders threw everything into one final gamble. The British Empire's grand strategy hung on these August battles. Breakthrough here meant victory and the road to Constantinople, while failure would doom hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers to slow death on a barren peninsula that had already consumed more lives than anyone dared count. The sound of digging echoed through the early August nights, as both sides prepared for what everyone knew would be the decisive assault. At Lone Pine, known to the Ottomans as Kanlasert Bloody Ridge, the defensive positions had evolved into something unprecedented in military history. The trenches were not mere ditches but underground labyrinths, covered with heavy timber and camouflaged with earth and brush. Men lived and fought in a subterranean world where daylight never penetrated. When the Australian 3rd Brigade launched their assault on August 6th, they discovered that taking the trenches was only the beginning of the nightmare. The wooden roofing that protected Ottoman defenders from artillery also trapped the attackers underground with their enemies. Soldiers found themselves fighting hand-to-hand in cramped spaces lit only by muzzle flashes, breathing air thick with gunpowder smoke and the metallic taste of blood. The fighting degenerated into something primeval. Men used bayonets, entrenching tools, and bare hands to kill opponents they could barely see in the darkness. The wooden beams groaned and splintered under the weight of struggling bodies, occasionally collapsing to crush friend and foe alike. Some sections of trench changed hands multiple times in a single hour, as small groups of soldiers fought room-to-room battles in an underground maze where the walls themselves bled. 1 kilometre north, the Nek Çatalköprü to the Ottoman defenders presented an entirely different kind of hell. This narrow ridge, barely wider than a football field, became the scene of one of the war's most concentrated slaughters. The Ottoman 18th Regiment had positioned themselves with mathematical precision, their rifles and machine guns covering every approach with interlocking fields of fire. At 4:30 in the morning on August 7th, the first wave of Australian light horse charged across the exposed ground. They covered less than 50 metres before Ottoman fire cut them down in windows. The survivors threw themselves into shell holes and behind scattered rocks, but there was no real cover on the naked ridge. Wave after wave followed, each advance ending in the same methodical destruction as Ottoman marksmen picked off individual targets with the calm efficiency of men at a shooting gallery. The carnage was visible from the Ottoman positions. Soldiers later described watching the Australian infantry emerge from their trenches like toy soldiers, only to crumple and fall before reaching the halfway point. Some Ottoman defenders stopped firing, sickened by the one-sided slaughter, but their officers ordered them to continue. By the end of the day, the ground between the trenches was carpeted with khaki-clad bodies that would remain there for months. Meanwhile, at Chunuk Bair, the Conkbayırı heights that dominated the entire peninsula, the most crucial battle of the campaign was reaching its climax. British and New Zealand forces had managed to reach the summit on August 8th, achieving the breakthrough that Allied commanders had dreamed of for months. From these heights, they could observe Ottoman positions across the peninsula and direct artillery fire that would make the defenders' situation impossible. Mustafa Kemal understood the implications immediately. If the Allies held Chunuk Bair, the entire Ottoman defense would collapse within days. He massed every available unit for a dawn counterattack on August 10th, personally leading the assault that would determine whether the Ottoman Empire survived the war. The sight of their commander advancing under enemy fire galvanized troops who had been fighting without rest for 3 months. The Ottoman counterattack began at dawn with a bayonet charge that relied on shock and momentum rather than firepower. Kemal's men advanced through devastating artillery fire, closing with New Zealand defenders who had spent 2 sleepless days consolidating their positions. The fighting was savage, and personal men stabbed and clubbed each other on the rocky summit, while artillery from both sides continued to fall among the combatants. By noon, Ottoman forces had retaken the crest, but the cost was horrific. Entire companies had been reduced to handfuls of survivors, and Kemal himself was wounded by shrapnel that destroyed his pocket watch and probably saved his life. The New Zealanders retreated down the reverse slope, leaving behind equipment and casualties that would mark the high water mark of Allied success at Gallipoli. The Suvla Bay landings, launched simultaneously on August 6th and 7th, represented the war's last attempt to achieve strategic surprise. Fresh British divisions, untouched by the Peninsula's grinding attrition, came ashore at beaches that were only lightly defended. For a few hours, it appeared that the Allies might finally achieve the breakthrough that had eluded them for months. But Ottoman reserves, including the 7th and 12th Divisions, reached the Anafata ridgeline through forced night marches that pushed men beyond the limits of endurance. Soldiers collapsed from exhaustion and heat stroke, but their commanders drove them forward with the knowledge that failure meant the end of everything. By dawn on August 8th, Ottoman forces had established defensive positions that would contain the Suvla landings just as effectively as the original beachheads. On August 21st, at Scimitar Hill, Yusufçuk Tepe, the final horror of the August battles unfolded. Shell bursts ignited the dry scrubland, and brush fires spread faster than men could run. Wounded soldiers from both sides burned alive while their comrades fought desperately to reach them through walls of flame. Ottoman and Allied rescuers worked together, beating at the fires with greatcoats and blankets, but many died in the flames that reduced human beings to charred shapes scattered across the hillsides. Picture yourself on that burning ridge, choking on smoke, while the screams of dying men mixed with the roar of flames that consumed everything in their path. The August battles had failed to break the deadlock, but they had proven something else, that modern industrial warfare could produce casualties on a scale that dwarfed anything in human history, yet still failed to achieve decisive victory. HMS Triumph rolled over and sank off ANZAC Cove on May 25th, as the German submarine U-21 slipped away beneath the waves, proving that even the world's most powerful battleships were helpless against an enemy they couldn't see coming. The submarine threat transformed the entire nature of the Gallipoli campaign, forcing the Royal Navy to abandon the close support that had kept Allied troops alive during the darkest moments of the landing. Without battleship guns to suppress Ottoman artillery, the men clinging to their precarious footholds faced a new level of isolation that would test every assumption about modern amphibious warfare. The ocean had become a hunting ground where death approached silently from below. 2 days after Triumph disappeared, HMS Majestic joined her on the seafloor, torpedoed by the same German U-boat while her crew scrambled desperately to escape the flooding compartments. The sound of her death agonies, the screaming of twisted metal, and the rush of water into broken compartments carried across the water to Allied positions, where soldiers understood they were now truly alone. Ottoman coastal batteries seized this opportunity with deadly efficiency. Guns salvaged from the ironclad Mesudier, torpedoed back in December 1914, found new life in concrete emplacements overlooking the straits. These relocated weapons, combined with existing artillery, created overlapping fields of fire that could reach any ship attempting to provide naval gunfire support. The thunder of heavy-caliber shells echoed across the peninsula as Ottoman gunners engaged targets they could actually see, rather than firing blind into the maze of Allied trenches. Behind the lines, the logistics of keeping an army supplied under these conditions tested human ingenuity to its limits. Supply routes ran by ferry from Çanakkale across the Narrows, where every crossing risked submarine attack or air raid. Ox carts and mules carried shells and bred up goat tracks that would challenge experienced mountaineers, moving only at night to avoid Allied observation posts that could call down devastating artillery fire on any movement. Ottoman artillery batteries faced their own critical shortage ammunition. The thunder of the guns was deceptive. Many batteries were limited to 20 to 30 shells per gun per day during peak fighting periods. This forced a fire discipline that would have been unthinkable in other theatres of war. Gunners learned to make every shot count, carefully selecting targets and coordinating with forward observers who risked their lives to provide accurate range corrections. The guns themselves were a mixture of German efficiency and Ottoman resourcefulness. 75 and 77mm field guns provided direct support to infantry, while 105 and 150mm howitzers delivered indirect fire against Allied positions they couldn't see. Heavy batteries positioned along the straits offered counter-battery fire when ammunition supplies allowed, their crews working with the mechanical precision of men who knew their survival depended on superior gunnery. Artillery observers used signal mirrors and coloured panels positioned on ridge knolls to bracket enemy batteries beyond direct sight. The flash of reflected sunlight became a deadly form of communication, directing fire onto Allied positions with an accuracy that impressed even enemy artillerymen. These observation posts operated under constant threat from Allied snipers, who understood the critical importance of blinding the Ottoman guns. In the midst of this mechanized slaughter, the ancient rhythms of Islamic life continued with remarkable persistence. Ramadan in 1333, Anno Hejri, July to August 1915, overlapped with the most intense fighting of the entire campaign. Many soldiers observed the fast despite the physical demands of combat, breaking their fast with dates and water at sunset while artillery continued to thunder overhead. The sound of the adhan, the call to prayer, echoed along the trenches at the appointed hours, providing a spiritual anchor in a world that seemed to have abandoned all moral restraints. Prayer lines formed behind parapets at dawn, men prostrating themselves on rough ground while enemy snipers waited for any exposed target. Imams serving with the units often doubled as medics and scribes for illiterate conscripts from Anatolian villages, writing final letters that many families would treasure as their only memorial to sons who never returned home. These religious observances provided more than spiritual comfort. They maintained unit cohesion among men drawn from across the Ottoman Empire. Morale boosts came from shared rituals that connected soldiers to something larger than the immediate horror of their situation. The smell of shared coffee grounds, carried by runners between positions, became as important as ammunition for maintaining fighting spirit. Cultural life in the trenches developed its own unique character. The saz, a traditional stringed instrument, appeared in forward positions where soldiers quietly sang Turku folk songs that spoke of home and love and loss. Letters travelled via the Çanakkale censor office, carrying news between the front lines and villages scattered across Anatolia, where families waited for word that might never come. Ottoman intelligence operations focused on extracting tactical information from captured enemy soldiers. Interrogators learned to identify unit patches and military slang that could reveal Allied order of battle and planned operations. Maps marked Tommy cookhouses as artillery targets, recognizing that disrupting enemy meal preparation could damage morale as effectively as destroying ammunition dumps. Ottoman scouts worked methodically to map enemy wire by counting pickets at night, crawling forward to measure distances and identify weak points in Allied defences. These reconnaissance missions required extraordinary courage men, working alone in no man's land where the slightest noise could trigger deadly machine gun fire. Raiders cut 5 to 10 metre lanes through wire obstacles, preparing avenues of approach for dawn assaults that might capture a few yards of worthless ground at the cost of dozens of lives. The intelligence picture extended to seemingly mundane details that could prove tactically significant. A burial company near Suvla Bay recorded 120 Ottoman and 200 Allied interments in a single day, noting dried mud on eyelids in their ledger, evidence of the dehydration that weakened both armies as summer temperatures soared beyond human tolerance. Can you imagine maintaining the discipline to observe religious fasts while fighting for your life in conditions that would challenge the strongest faith? As autumn approached and the first hints of winter weather began to appear on the horizon, both sides sensed that time was running out for grand strategic solutions, but neither could imagine the natural catastrophe that would soon make human warfare seem like a minor inconvenience. A frozen mule stood upright in an ice trench near Kireçtepe after the sudden cold snap, its legs locked in place by ice that had formed so quickly the animal died standing, a grotesque monument to the merciless winter that struck Gallipoli like a divine punishment. The blizzard that began on November 27th, 1915, proved that nature could kill more efficiently than any human weapon. For soldiers who had survived 8 months of mechanized slaughter, this meteorological assault represented an enemy that couldn't be fought with rifles or artillery, only endured by men already pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. The first warning came as sleet, driving horizontal sheets of ice that stung exposed skin and turned the clay soil into a slippery morass that made movement treacherous. Ottoman soldiers, many still wearing summer-weight uniforms, huddled in trenches that offered no protection from the wind that howled across the peninsula like the voices of all the men who had died there. The temperature plummeted so rapidly that water froze in canteens before men could drink it. Within 48 hours, the sleet became a full blizzard that buried the front lines under snow that drifted waist-deep in the communication trenches. Ottoman positions that had been carefully maintained for months disappeared under white blankets that erased the landmarks men used to navigate in darkness. Soldiers became lost trying to reach positions only 50 meters away, wandering in circles until exhaustion and hypothermia claimed them. The improvised dugouts that had provided shelter during the autumn rains collapsed under the weight of wet snow and ice. Pine planks and corrugated iron sheets, salvaged from captured Allied stores, cracked and split in the extreme cold. Men who had grown accustomed to the luxury of overhead protection found themselves exposed to the elements with no materials available to rebuild their shelters. The sound of collapsing structures echoed through the night as entire sections of the front line became uninhabitable. Hundreds of soldiers on both sides suffered frostbite so severe that amputation became the only treatment available to field surgeons. Men who had survived bullets and shrapnel found their fingers and toes turning black as circulation failed in extremities that had been exposed too long to the killing cold. The screams from medical stations took on a different quality, not the sharp agony of sudden wounds, but the deep, despairing moans of men watching their bodies destroy themselves. Some trenches flooded waist-deep as snow melted and refroze, creating ice water pools that trapped soldiers in conditions no human being should have been asked to endure. Men stood in freezing water for hours at a time, their legs going numb as frostbite crept up from their feet. Those who tried to climb out of the flooded positions often slipped on ice-covered parapets, falling back into the water that would eventually kill them. Food supplies, already inadequate during the summer fighting, became a critical crisis as transport animals died in the cold and supply routes became impassable. Bulgur bread soup, thickened with whatever animal fat could be found, represented a feast for men who often went days without hot food. The communal cooking fires that had provided both warmth and sustenance became impossible to maintain as fuel supplies dwindled and everything combustible became soaked with melting snow. Food fatigue, the psychological effect of eating the same meager rations for months, combined with actual starvation to break down the physical resistance that had kept men fighting through the autumn battles. Officers sometimes secured tinned sardines from German supply depots, sharing these delicacies among entire companies of men who had forgotten what real food tasted like. The smell of cooking, when it occurred at all, became a torture for soldiers who had no access to hot meals. Medical evacuation, already a challenge during the summer months, became nearly impossible as the roads to Çanakkale turned into ice-covered tracks that claimed the lives of wounded men who might have survived their injuries in better conditions. Medical stations at Conkbayırı and Akbaş ran out of firewood to heat the buildings where surgeons worked on frostbite victims, whose wounds had been complicated by infections that thrived in the cold, wet conditions. In this nightmare landscape, small human details took on enormous significance. A field notebook discovered years later records the story of a cat adopted by a trench company, an animal that slept atop warm machine gun jackets and killed the rats that had become a plague in positions where sanitation had broken down completely. Men who had become hardened to human suffering found comfort in caring for this small creature that represented life continuing despite the surrounding death. A drummer boy from Balıkesir carried a broken bugle through the winter fighting, blowing breath through the cracked instrument and claiming that the enemy still hears Allah's wind. This mixture of gallows humor and spiritual faith sustained men who had lost everything else. The sound of his silent bugle became a rallying point for soldiers who understood that their survival depended on maintaining hope in the face of conditions that would have broken previous generations. Ottoman snipers, working from positions that provided minimal protection from the elements, developed new tactics to conserve body heat while maintaining their deadly efficiency. Popular tricks included setting empty helmets on sticks to draw Allied fire and map enemy firing positions, but in winter conditions, these decoy operations became endurance contests, where the sniper who could remain motionless longest often won simply by outlasting opponents who succumbed to hypothermia. The sensory landscape of the winter front defied description. Smell markers that had defined trench life during the summer cordite, rotting flesh, and boiled onions from field kitchens gave way to the clean, sterile smell of snow mixed with the acrid smoke from fires that men fought desperately to keep burning. The soundscape changed as well, with the crack thud of rifle bullets replaced by the whisper of wind through frozen equipment and the occasional crash of ice-laden structures collapsing under their own weight. Yet even in these conditions, some aspects of military routine continued with stubborn persistence. Muezzin calls still echoed across the frozen battlefield, though the voices of the prayer callers cracked in the cold air. The ritual of prayer provided warmth through movement and spiritual comfort for men who understood they might not survive until spring. Communication between positions relied more heavily on visual signals as telephone lines froze and snapped under the weight of ice accumulation. Can you imagine trying to maintain fighting positions in conditions where simply staying alive required every ounce of energy and willpower you possessed? As December approached and rumours began circulating about strange Allied activity during the darkest hours before dawn, Ottoman commanders sensed that their enemies were planning something that would either break the deadlock or acknowledge that the Gallipoli campaign had become unsustainable for both sides. Ottoman sentries noticed the patrol clatter from Allied lines had grown strangely quiet in the hours before dawn on December 20th, 1915, but they had no way of knowing they were witnessing the most successful military evacuation in modern history, the silent withdrawal of an entire army under their very noses. The evacuation of Gallipoli represented more than tactical retreat. It marked the end of Britain's grand strategy to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war through a swift knockout blow. After 8 months of unprecedented slaughter, the Allied forces faced a choice between reinforcing failure or accepting that some objectives simply couldn't be achieved, regardless of the blood invested in pursuing them. The first hints came in seemingly insignificant details that only the most experienced Ottoman soldiers recognized as significant. The usual nighttime sounds from Allied positions, the clink of equipment, muffled conversations, and the scrape of entrenching tools had diminished to almost nothing. Veteran non-commissioned officers, who had spent months learning to interpret every sound from across no man's land, sensed something had changed, but couldn't identify exactly what felt different about the enemy lines. Allied deception operations had reached a level of sophistication that impressed even Ottoman intelligence officers who discovered the details months later. Self-firing rifles, triggered by dripping water or slowly burning fuses, maintained the illusion of normal sentry activity long after the positions had been abandoned. Stoves left burning in dugouts created heat signatures that suggested ongoing occupation to any Ottoman observers equipped with night vision equipment. The evacuation itself represented a logistical masterpiece that saved thousands of Allied lives through meticulous planning and flawless execution. Ships approached the beaches during the darkest hours, their engines muffled and their lights extinguished, loading men and equipment with the silence of professional burglars. The troops themselves had practiced the withdrawal procedures for weeks, learning to move without the metallic sounds that had characterized 8 months of trench warfare. At ANZAC Cove and Suvla Bay, the withdrawal proceeded with clockwork precision during the nights of December 19th and 20th. Men who had lived like moles in underground warrens emerged carrying only essential equipment, leaving behind mountains of supplies that represented months of dangerous transport operations. The beaches that had witnessed such carnage during the April landings now saw a different kind of military operation, the careful orchestration of strategic retreat. Ottoman patrols approaching the abandoned positions on December 21st discovered a landscape transformed overnight into a military ghost town. Trenches that had housed thousands of enemy soldiers stood empty, their carefully constructed defences intact but devoid of human presence. The silence was so complete that some Ottoman soldiers suspected an elaborate trap, approaching the Allied lines with weapons ready for ambush. What they found instead was evidence of an army that had simply vanished. Intact stoves still warm from recent use, stacked tins of food arranged as if their owners intended to return for dinner, and wired trip rifles that continued to fire at random intervals, maintaining the deadly illusion long after their operators had sailed away. The discovery process took hours as Ottoman soldiers methodically cleared each position, expecting at any moment to encounter the rear guard that never materialized. The psychological impact of finding themselves alone on the peninsula created a strange mixture of triumph and anticlimax among Ottoman troops who had spent 8 months preparing for a final decisive battle. Men who had lived with constant danger suddenly found themselves walking freely through areas that had been death traps for months. The silence felt unnatural after so long listening to the sounds of enemy activity just meters away. Small personal discoveries told the story of men who had been forced to abandon possessions that connected them to home and normal life. An Ottoman corporal near Shell Green pocketed a cricket ball left behind by Australian troops, later writing to his son, "The enemy left us a toy and an empty sea." These mundane objects, playing cards, photographs, letters from home humanized an enemy that had been reduced to muzzle flashes and rifle reports for most of the campaign. Medical supplies left behind in Allied aid stations provided desperately needed resources for Ottoman medical units that had operated with critical shortages throughout the campaign. Morphine, surgical instruments, and bandages that could save Ottoman lives represented an unexpected dividend from the enemy withdrawal. Field hospitals that had struggled to treat wounded soldiers with inadequate supplies suddenly found themselves better equipped than they had been since the campaign began. The final Allied withdrawal from Cape Helles occurred during the nights of January 8th and 9th, 1916, completing the evacuation under similarly deceptive conditions. By dawn on January 10th, the last Allied soldiers had departed, leaving behind only the physical evidence of 8 months that had changed the nature of warfare and the political landscape of 3 empires. Ottoman assessments of the campaign would credit several factors for their successful defense: interior lines of communication that allowed rapid reinforcement, terrain familiarity that gave defenders critical advantages, and the leadership of commanders who understood that this battle would determine their empire's survival. The failure of the Allied amphibious assault validated Ottoman strategic thinking about the difficulties of projecting power across water against prepared defences. Yet the cost had been staggering for both sides. Ottoman casualties killed, wounded, missing, and sick were estimated between 250,000 and 300,000 men, with the dead numbering between 56,000 and 87,000, though historians continue to debate these figures. Entire regiments had been reduced to company strength, and some divisions existed only on paper by the campaign's end. The silence that followed the Allied departure felt almost supernatural to men who had grown accustomed to the constant noise of modern warfare. No more artillery exchanges, no more sniper duels, no more sounds of men dying in no man's land during failed night raids. The Peninsula had returned to the pastoral quiet that had characterized it before the war, broken only by the occasional bleating of goats that had somehow survived 8 months of industrial killing. Can you imagine walking through trenches where thousands of men had lived and died, now empty except for the personal possessions they'd been forced to abandon in their retreat to the sea? As Ottoman soldiers explored the abandoned Allied positions and began the grim task of clearing battlefield debris that would take months to complete, they understood they had witnessed something unprecedented, but whether it represented victory or merely survival would be determined by events still to unfold across the broader war. In the months after the Allied ships disappeared over the horizon, Ottoman burial details discovered that the earth around Conkbayırı had been so saturated with blood that wildflowers grew in patterns that traced the old trench lines, marking the ground where an empire had fought for its life and won. This victory at Gallipoli would prove to be the Ottoman Empire's last great triumph, a defensive masterpiece that preserved Constantinople from naval assault and bought precious time for a state that was already dying from wounds inflicted across multiple fronts. Yet for the men who had survived 8 months of mechanized hell, the meaning of their sacrifice would only become clear in the decades that followed, when the empire they had defended ceased to exist and a new nation rose from its ashes. The immediate aftermath revealed the true scope of what had been accomplished and what it had cost. Ottoman forces had defeated the most ambitious amphibious assault in military history, turning back a combined British, French, Australian, New Zealand, and colonial force that represented the peak of Allied military power. The strategic implications rippled across the global conflict. Russia remained cut off from Western supplies. The Central Powers maintained their southeastern ally, and British prestige suffered a blow from which it would never fully recover. Mustafa Kemal emerged from the campaign as the Ottoman Empire's most celebrated military commander, receiving the Imtiaz Medal and promotion to colonel for his role in the defense. His tactical brilliance at Conkbayırı had saved the peninsula during the critical first days, while his later leadership during the August battles cemented his reputation as a commander who could match any European general. The 34-year-old officer who had ordered his men to die rather than retreat had become a national hero whose future would reshape the entire region. The 24th of May armistice, when Ottoman and Allied soldiers worked together to bury their dead, became a powerful propaganda theme in Istanbul newspapers. The image of Ottoman chivalry, operating under both Islamic and military law, provided a stark contrast to the industrial slaughter that characterized other fronts. This single day of humanity amid months of mechanized killing would be remembered as evidence that Ottoman soldiers could match European standards of military honor while defending their homeland against invasion. The political consequences extended far beyond military success. The Committee of Union and Progress, the party that had led the Ottoman Empire into the war, saw its domestic prestige soar as news of the Gallipoli victory spread throughout the empire. The defense had proven that Ottoman forces, when properly led and equipped, could defeat the armies of the great powers. For a state that had been labelled the sick man of Europe, this represented a psychological transformation that would influence political developments for decades. Greek and Turkish civilians who had been evacuated from Peninsula villages during the early fighting returned to find their homes transformed into battlefields, littered with the debris of modern warfare. Some houses had been converted into forward aid posts and ammunition dumps, their walls pockmarked with bullet holes and shrapnel scars. These civilians became witnesses to what their homeland had endured, carrying stories of the campaign back to communities across Anatolia, where families had sent sons to fight on the peninsula. In the months following the Allied departure, Ottoman engineers began the massive task of clearing battlefield debris that would take years to complete. Unexploded shells, miles of barbed wire, abandoned equipment, and the personal possessions of soldiers from 6 different nations covered the landscape like the remnants of some industrial catastrophe. Each discovery told part of the story: Australian slouch hat caught on wire, a French prayer book in a flooded trench, a New Zealand soldier's photograph of a woman who would never know how her man had died. The medical legacy proved equally complex. Soldiers who had survived dysentery, malaria, and months of malnutrition faced long recoveries that many would never complete. Ottoman hospitals in Constantinople and Smyrna, filled with men whose bodies had been broken by the campaign's conditions rather than enemy weapons. Frostbite victims required amputations that left them disabled for life, while others suffered from what would later be recognized as shell shock, the psychological wounds inflicted by prolonged exposure to industrial warfare. Post-campaign military assessments credited 3 key factors for Ottoman success: interior lines of communication that allowed rapid reinforcement of threatened sectors, terrain familiarity that gave defenders critical advantages in navigation and positioning, and the leadership quality of commanders who understood that defeat meant the end of their empire. These lessons would influence Ottoman defensive planning for the remainder of the war, though they would prove less applicable to the mobile warfare that soon developed on other fronts. The human cost remained staggering, even in victory. Ottoman casualties killed, wounded, missing, and sick were estimated between 250,000 and 300,000 men, representing nearly the entire strength of a peacetime army. Entire villages in Anatolia had sent their young men to Gallipoli and received back only official notification of death or disability. The demographic impact would be felt for generations as communities struggled to rebuild with severely reduced male populations. Individual stories of survival and loss illustrated the campaign's personal dimension. Veterans returning to their villages carried physical and psychological scars that marked them as men who had experienced something beyond normal human endurance. Some found readjustment to civilian life impossible, having been changed by months of living with death as a constant companion. Others channeled their experience into leadership roles that would prove crucial during the political upheavals that followed the war's end. The strategic significance became clearer as the war continued, and Ottoman forces faced disasters on other fronts. The British Empire, denied a quick victory at Gallipoli, was forced to commit resources to Middle Eastern campaigns that might have been decisive in France or Mesopotamia. The successful defense had strategic implications that extended far beyond the peninsula itself, affecting Allied planning and resource allocation throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. For the Allied forces, the evacuation represented a masterpiece of military logistics, but could not disguise the fundamental failure of their strategic objectives. The Dardanelles remained closed, Constantinople stayed in Ottoman hands, and Russia received no relief from the supply blockade that contributed to the revolution that would soon remove her from the war entirely. The careers of Allied commanders never recovered from their association with the campaign, while the political consequences contributed to government changes in London and other Allied capitals. The landscape itself bore permanent scars from 8 months of industrial warfare. Artillery bombardments had torn the earth apart, creating a moonscape of shell craters and collapsed trenches that would remain visible for decades. Local ecosystems had been destroyed by chemical contamination from explosives and the massive accumulation of human waste and decomposing organic matter. The peninsula would require years to heal from wounds inflicted by modern warfare's industrial capacity for destruction. Yet from this devastation emerged something unexpected, a new sense of Turkish national identity that transcended the religious and ethnic divisions that had characterized the Ottoman Empire. Soldiers who had fought side by side, regardless of their regional origins or social backgrounds, shared a common experience that would prove foundational to the political movements that followed the war. The defense of Gallipoli became a unifying myth that helped forge the modern Turkish nation from the ruins of the Ottoman Empire. Can you imagine returning to your village as one of the few survivors from an entire generation that had marched away to war, carrying memories of a victory that had cost everything you'd ever known? As spring returned to the peninsula in 1916 and wildflowers bloomed in soil enriched by the blood of heroes from 6 nations, the survivors understood they had witnessed both an ending and a beginning, the last great victory of an ancient empire and the first chapter in the story of a nation yet to be born.